Energy Transition, episode number 67. Our topic today is the future of cars. Good morning and good afternoon. Irina Islav, Temi Nimet, David Blackman.
Good
Hello.
morning.
Hello.
Let please share for our audience that they can comment and make questions using the social network they are using. So you can share and we can put the questions here in this our screen. Okay. Among others, here are some different energy sources, types of technologies, business models. So is a list of them that we can see: gasoline cars, autonomous driving, and so. But the question is, please starting with David, for the decade of 2030, what your visions for cars, especially related to energies, David, and later Irina and Temi.
So the 2030s, I think it's still going to be over 90% internal combustion cars. I know the governments in the Western world are trying to force electric vehicles to come to fruition, but they don't seem to be dealing from a standpoint of reality of how the real world operates. It takes many years to affect such a massive transition to electric vehicles, and as we've discussed many times here, resource limitations and supply chain limitations are going to really severely limit the ability, the rate of growth in the electric vehicle industry. And unless and until the Western governments start to deal with the realities of that situation and stop focusing all of their subsidies and energy on promoting electric vehicles, um, the internal combustion cars are going to continue to be to really dominate the market. And I mean, we're even seeing it, U.S. manufacturers still introducing new lines of gas powered automobiles, despite all of this effort by the Biden government to force them to adopt electric vehicles and move solely to them. And the industries are the companies are dealing with reality, even if the government isn't, and the demand for electric vehicles and their ability to really scale up to displace gas powered cars just isn't
And,
materializing the way they want.
and if you think 2050 or 2070, what's your vision? 50.
My view is that it will still be mainly internal combustion cars, even after 2050, long after 2050. And, governments can only force so much. The real world always intervenes.
Temi, think the same?
Yeah, it's interesting because the governments in the Western world are setting all of these signals out there so that the industry, once they retool a factory to do manufacture electric vehicles, it'll be very difficult to go back to internal combustion engine factories. So I feel like they're sending these signals to force the companies to retool their manufacturing so that it'll be very difficult to get new internal combustion engine vehicles. So, that's why they're setting these targets of 2030, 2035, whatever, um, because companies will invest. And then if another government comes into power and says, you know what, we need to go back to reality, the companies will complain and say, we just spent all this money to retool. And, the reality is this other thing. So I, I don't know. I agree that the internal combustion engine will still be there. The other issue would be, will there still be service stations? Because if they ban the production or the refining or these other things and push for electric vehicle charging everywhere, it could be that they phase out service stations. So you might have an internal combustion engine vehicle, but you won't be able to get the fuel to put in there. And they can do that through any number of ways, whether it's through financial accounting standards that have to take climate into account, or they just ban it, phase it out, make it really difficult through regulations. There's always that possibility as well.
Irina, think the same. I mean, you see ethanol or biodiesel or hydrogen coming stronger?
No, there has been a lot of talk about hydrogen replacing ICE cars, but it's not happening, not at any scale. I agree with Tammy that despite reality intervening, as David said, governments could force reality the way they want by banning, by phasing out service stations, which means that there is a possibility that travel in your own vehicle could become a luxury that few can afford. Or, of course, there are already bans on internal combustion engine vehicles in place in the European Union and the UK. Realistically, these bans shouldn't materialize. They can't, because they will severely affect people's ability to move from place to place in their own vehicle. But who cares about having your own vehicle when you have a climate change agenda to force, basically force down our throats? But I do hope that reality will prevail and these truly insane plans will be revised at some point.
And can I just add before we move on?
Sure.
What Irina just said and Tammy both. That is certainly the plan that the World Economic Forum is promoting, right? They released the plan last week, or a week before last, I guess it was, for governments in the Western world to force policies that would reduce the number of vehicles on the road by 2050, just 27 years from now, from 1.4 billion, which is the estimate today, to just 500 million cars. Well, what does that mean? That means they want us all to live very small lives, never travel, not have the ability to move around, and be isolated in these planned cities, these 15-minute cities Tammy and Irina have talked about several times. And that really is the plan the WEF wants to force. And the only way to force that is through the Western democracies transforming their governments into authoritarian socialist forms of government.
They already
free
are.
elections are no longer held. That's the only way to do that. And so when you see plans like that coming from the WEF, that's what that means. That's the only point I wanted to add.
Could we try some numbers? I mean, in terms of the total cars in 2050, for instance, how much of them will be oil and gas, and how much is renewables?
Well, what's interesting about that World Economic Forum study is which is based on the University of California Davis study from 2017, is that they really don't care if it's electric or not. They want a hard cap on vehicles, period. So 500 million cars, regardless of whether it's electric or not. So they're telling us that we can just swap one form of transport for another, right? You can have your car just be electric. Well, it turns out, no. Even if it's electric, it doesn't matter. It's 500 million. That's the cap. And I think part of that is because of materials, right? I mean, there's just not enough. The competition for it will, of course, increase the cost of the raw materials and so on. And we end up with new resource competition. And if I could just make one point here, China right now has 319 million cars. So how are they going to distribute this 500 million cap? Is it per cap? Like, is it based on population? So China gets this percentage and America gets this much and so on and so forth. How does that work? They're trying to say that there's this limit. Well, who gets to decide that? Why can't a country decide on its own? Right? Klaus Schwab or whoever, or
how are they going to force it on the Chinese? That's what I'd like to see.
Right. Well, they already do license plate lotteries. they do lotteries, right? So if you have the right social credit score, you can put your name in for the lottery. Then maybe you get chosen to get a license plate, which permits you to buy a vehicle. So is this what they're planning to roll out for the rest of the world? That if
Sure.
your social credit score is good enough, you can put your name in for a vehicle, maybe if you're
Well, I
lucky.
mean, it's like Jennifer Granholm said a couple of months ago. We have a lot to learn from China where
From
energy
China.
is concerned.
Yeah, that's
Great.
right.
Literally, our energy secretary said that. So
Yeah, that's right. SRB, David, is for you. It's a very technical question.
I don't even understand that. One megajoules per kg.
Kilogram.
What is that?
It's a
Kilograms?
density,
Kilogram.
density of energy density. Yeah,
Energy
Oh,
density.
energy
Yeah.
density, of course. Well,
yeah.
whoops,
Yep.
my screen just went
Right.
dead. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I got you. And until this reality changes, battery electric vehicles will only remain a niche technology, regardless of what the political establishment does. Yeah, I mean, that's what they are. They're a niche luxury item that only less than 5% of our population, even in the prosperous United States, can afford. And I don't really see that changing much. I just don't. I don't think their technology, their construction, or their business model allow for that to change in any significant way in the coming years. Certainly not by 2030. I mean, the 2030 goals of the Biden administration are just a fantasy.
That's good. Let me change our point. Do you believe that one day, in the near future, the transportation will be done by autonomous vehicles or always people driving?
I hope not.
Is it not? It's not
Well,
reliable.
no, I wouldn't trust autonomous driving technology. Sorry, I just wouldn't.
But it's a reality. A part of Uber, for instance, United States are using autonomous vehicles. No, David.
I just have a hard time trusting that. I'm not the world's greatest driver myself, but I'd much rather trust myself or my wife to drive
Exactly.
than a computer. And I know Elon Musk thinks it's all coming and it's inevitable, and he's a billionaire and I'm not, so maybe he's right.
Oh, computers can break down. Electronics can, get damaged or whatever it's called, and they can get hacked too.
Yeah, that's true.
And
But
I'm not okay with this idea.
yeah, but airplanes can be hacked too.
Well, I
Well,
think it's a little bit
yeah,
different.
yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Jamie.
different for what? What's the reason of different?
If
I'm
you have,
stressing you.
yeah, it's okay. If you have all of these autonomous vehicles on the road and you want to have to create little accidents along the highway and you want to hack into vehicles, you can do that. I think it's more difficult perhaps to hack into an airline. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know enough about
They have
that
pilots.
issue. And there's
Yeah,
Even
they
with
have
an
pilots.
autopilot on, they still have human pilots. And the
Although to be
autopilot,
fair,
I think can't do takeoff and landing. I think.
there's an autonomous bus at a technology site near Oxford, and they have this autonomous bus running around the campus to take people from building to building, and there's a driver sitting there just in case.
Right. Yeah.
So
And I do think in limited applications like that, the autonomous technology is probably fine when you have a limited application
Exactly.
on a campus site like that with very strict rules about traffic flows and pedestrian walkways and things like. As long as everybody stays in their lines, I think
Yeah,
it's probably all fine, right? But you get outside the lines, I think you have. I just don't trust it, and I think most people don't trust it.
if it's selective, I just remember that we were in Copenhagen a few years ago, and the underground was remotely operated. I think I didn't see a driver there. Maybe there was somebody on the train,
You're
but
sleeping in the train.
I don't know. I didn't see anything, but it's the underground. I mean, it's relatively easier to control. Well, it's much easier to control than highway traffic.
Yeah, that's interesting. And hydrogen. Let's talk a little bit about hydrogen fuel cell.
Let's talk about hydrogen.
Do you agree that for heavy cars they may be viable?
It is a viable technology. It's just very expensive.
That's the point.
And you have to have so many trillions of dollars in investment in new infrastructure for it. Is, you know, again, the timelines are much more extended than these central planners.
And it has to be green hydrogen in order to be politically correct.
Right, and that only extends the timelines further, right?
And prices are high for green hydrogen. Yeah.
Well, in Canada, there was Ballard that had developed the hydrogen fuel cell, and or fuel cells of some kind, and they built a whole bunch of buses for the 2010 Olympics, at which they recently sold to China because they were too expensive to maintain. So I don't know. There's maintenance issues. There's all different kinds of issues with that. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just that hydrogen is a very small molecule. There's lots of possibilities for escape, whether it's in the pipelines or highly flammable. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But one of the vehicles you didn't put on there were LPGs. Because I remember when the prices spiked about 10 or so years ago, and even in the 80s, they switched over vehicles to natural gas or petroleum gas or propane or whatever, because it was cheaper. But I suspect that even if you're burning natural gas, it'll still be considered verboten.
Of course.
Because it's a very popular practice here. Most taxis, if not all taxis in Bulgaria, run on LPG because it's much cheaper. Yeah, there were even horrible examples of people turning high-end cars such as Maseratis and things like that, converting them to LPG. It just hurts to read about it.
The autonomy for these cars, the autonomy for this car is not high, so it's very small, but very little.
Well, I don't know. It's cheaper. That's its advantage. But they cannot park in underground parking lots.
Yeah,
because they're a hazard. So that's kind of limiting.
Talk a little bit about business models. The users, how users can contract a car. Do you see something new in terms of car sharing, subscription, renting, leasing? Something different from now?
Yeah, I mean, those things are already happening in limited applications to some extent, and I know that's where the central planners want to take us. And in some countries, maybe they'll have some success. I suspect they'll have very limited success doing that in the United States, but I wonder what others think.
Well, I mean, go ahead, Irina.
No, you go ahead.
Well, in China, they have Didi, which is a ride sharing thing, and they really are promoting the whole ride sharing where you put your name in on an app, and then it does like carpooling. So it's not just that you get an Uber or something, but you're sharing with other people who are going in the same direction, kind of thing. And this is an alternative to public transport. They call it ride sharing or whatever. One of the trends that I've noticed is that it's really difficult for young people to get a driver's license. So for young people, we might be resistant to this kind of thing, like it's reducing independence and so on and so forth. But for young people where it's very difficult to get a license to drive, then these are options that they're completely okay with. You know, they pull up an app, they say, oh, I want to ride share, whatever, and some Uber or something comes by and picks them up. So it's very possible that this is something acceptable for younger people.
Yeah, maybe they have a different idea of the sense of possession and the convenience of having your own car, and instead of having to use an app to call a vehicle to take you somewhere. you can just jump into the car and go somewhere, especially if it's an emergency.
Right.
Right.
But why is it so hard for young people to get a driver's license?
I don't know. I know that in my friend whose daughter lives in Vancouver, it took, I don't know, a couple of years to do it. And then you're a learner for a while, and then you're a medium learner. And if you do any infraction while you're in learner status, you're suspended for who knows how long. I
Well,
mean, it's really quite atrocious compared to what happened, how I got my license, which was super easy. But even here in the UK, it seems very difficult, a lot of hoops to jump through, takes a long time, very expensive. So not everybody can afford to do it.
Right. But it does make sense from a safety perspective because down here, it's very easy to get a license. You can pay for a license, although they're clamping down on this corruption practice. But it makes sense to me. It's good to make it hard to make sure people learn. Otherwise, we get 18-year-old drivers killing people on zebra crossings, which just happened recently. But yeah, if you make it prohibitively difficult and prohibitively expensive, of course they will switch to something else. And this is probably one more way to force people, with the best of intentions, of course, to use alternatives to having your own car.
Right.
David, I received a question from WhatsApp from a friend of mine called Edvald Dunn. He's a local content manager in Petrobras, and he asked, "Yep, what oil companies should do in terms of the future of cars?"
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a hard one for companies like ExxonMobil and Shell and BP. I was just reading a piece this morning in the Financial Times about how these net zero shareholder initiatives failed so miserably during the annual meetings of Chevron and ExxonMobil, with all but a handful getting less than 10% support, where last year they were getting 20 and 30%. So we're seeing a changing tide in these US run companies, whereas in Europe, Shell and BP, those kinds of shareholder initiatives, they're still, getting 30, 40, 50% report from
No, they're
support
not.
from the
Not this
shareholders.
year, David.
Not
No.
this
Yeah,
year.
they did. According to Financial Times, they were getting 38%, I think.
No, they got 20. Follow this, got 20 at Shell's AGM. They were crushed.
Okay, good.
Much
Well,
less than they got last year.
I think
Yeah.
that's a reflection of consumers, voters and consumers, shareholders waking up
Yep.
to the absurdity of these policies and the real life impacts they're going to have on everyone's lives if they're allowed to just continue.
Yep.
And that's what's being reflected in those votes.
Yeah.
Is an awakening public. And so what I think, the course these management teams have to steer is to stay relevant to their shareholders, first of all, their investors, but also to judge what's actually happening out there in the real world. And for the last 5 years, it's been this flood, this torrent of information coming into these boardrooms and executive suites, telling them they have to move to all these renewable investments and all these net zero commitments and all this stuff. And now suddenly, over the last several months, that tide is beginning to turn back. And I think what it tells us is that it's very difficult for governments in free countries, democratically elected governments, to just force these kinds of radical long-term policy shifts at such an enormous scale and maintain that. And so I think the key for all companies, and we're seeing Shell and BP move back to their core business, is to ensure your core business remains profitable. because you're probably going to end up going back to that core business in a pretty big way. And fortunately, I think for those majors, they've been able to do that, retain that profitability in their core business, and that's largely been because of the high prices in the last couple of years. We'll see how they're able to maintain it going forward as prices are softening considerably as we record this episode. So I just think that's the key for them is to just work to ensure that while they're sending all these signals to the ESG investors that they're doing all these things over on this side, that their core business remains healthy and profitable, because ultimately that's where the money's made, and that's what you'll end up going back to once this fad, I think, which is a fad, it passes to a large extent.
It's a much bigger problem for car makers, as
Yes.
Sami pointed out.
Yes.
Once you spend billions and billions on new production lines for electric drivetrains, you can just, recover
Right.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very hard.
So car makers are in a very, very difficult position, especially now that the problems, the inherent problems with EVs are starting to pop out like bubbles on the surface. Yeah. Did you see? Did you see? Or did one of you send me the news about the? No, it was a reader, a Substack reader, a report about the Ford F-150 Lightning, that
Yeah.
its range falls down considerably when it's carrying a load.
Sure.
Yeah.
Totally unexpected.
Totally
Nobody could have foreseen
Shocking.
it at all.
Surprising
Yeah.
to all the experts.
Yeah, or the fact
Yeah.
that insurers write off EVs after even a relatively minor accident because the battery could be damaged, and if the battery is damaged, then the car is a total loss.
Yeah.
It's things like that are starting to seep through.
Well,
Yeah,
that'll be
or-
another excuse why you shouldn't own one, that it should just be these ride sharing or
Yes,
autonomous
that's
that are
right.
paying
Yeah,
more attention
yeah.
to the road than you.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I
That's a good
will
point.
just one other point about the car makers retooling. One big event that was announced over the weekend here in the Dallas Fort Worth area where I live is that the big General Motors plant in Arlington, Texas, General Motors announced it's going to invest $500 million retooling that plant to continue making SUVs, gas powered SUVs, into the future. That's a $500 million upgrade to an existing SUV plant, the biggest one in the United States, announced by General Motors over the weekend, and it's received very little news attention outside of the Metroplex for some reason. Hard to imagine.
Wow,
why
that's
that would be.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Hmm.
There is something that I suppose there is no doubt about the automation that cars are receiving. A strong automation. Is it correct?
Is it the right thing to do?
That's a good question. But you see, tires, doors, controls are being automated in a very fast way.
Yeah.
I think that's all good. I mean, so I mean, if I understand the question, I think it's all good. It's just a product of advancing technology. Now, the problem is that it can have, I guess, ultimately start impacting jobs. It's going to reduce the number of jobs these automakers employ, as they not only automate what's happening in their cars, but also automating in their factories.
Factories,
right? Yeah. Even more than they already are. That's going to eliminate more and more jobs, and I mean, I think that's going to happen in every aspect of our society. It's inevitable.
If I could just go back to something that David and Irina mentioned, which was about how it's very difficult to put these kind of changes forward in a democracy if people understood what's actually entailed in all of this transition. And I think that the problem is they know people don't want it. And so now it's a matter of persuading people that this is the only way. And which is why I think a lot of the sort of climate change propaganda, if I can use that word, has become a little more hysterical. And I know, for example, in Canada, the environmental groups have commissioned over the past year 69 surveys of the public about climate change and the energy transition. And from those 69 surveys, they realized that people are still resistant to the idea. So one of the things that I read was that a couple of the groups are pinpointing certain arguments that are being made, such as solar panels not being as cost efficient as they say, that they're made with slave labor, whatever, and that they're going to try and label that as disinformation. And they're pushing
Wow.
forward with a lot of different narratives out there to try and persuade people that this is the only way forward. So, yes, we're in a democracy, but if the media and the means of communication are manipulated, then the general public won't necessarily see the reality that we're trying to express. And I'm waiting for the moment where YouTube suddenly puts disclaimers on what we're talking about and
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Disinformation.
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
disinformation.
And you know,
Or-
once upon a time, disinformation had to be labeling something as disinformation had to be explained with why this
Right.
is disinformation. Now it seems that the people you talk about, it's like they don't feel the need to explain themselves.
No.
It's disinformation because we say so, even if
and
it's
it's
a fact plain as day.
right.
But
It's a
we say-
disagreement of opinion or something is now suddenly disinformation. I disagree with you. It's disinformation.
Yeah.
That's right.
And I would
Yeah.
submit to y'all that that's one of the main reasons why the WEF wants to reduce our ability to move around freely. Because one of the best ways to collect real information outside of the propaganda is to be able to travel and move around and see it for
Direct
yourself.
contact.
Yeah.
And so the more they can limit our ability to be mobile, the more they can control these narratives.
That's
Grand
right.
finale, welcome.
Fine, welcome.
Capital destruction through the advancement of climate change initiatives while simultaneously eroding the labor force through automation and AI leaves a society heavily dependent on government. Yep.
And on technology.
And on technology.
That's right. That's right.
Technology
Except,
is easy
Irina,
to get hooked on.
you had that article where there's labor shortages for the transition.
Right.
This is the joke of the year, people.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
no comedian could have thought it up. Yes, there are not enough people to mine the materials. There are not enough people to organize the mining or the processing of the materials, or probably to assemble the EV batteries. There are not enough people, period.
In China? What about in China with the Uyghurs? You know, they have the Uyghurs.
I don't know. I have no access to Chinese, Chinese.
Yeah. There's plenty of
news
labor
outlets
in
in
China.
China.
When you can
In
force
Chinese.
slave labor, there's plenty of labor. But when you can't, there's a problem, right?
Well,
Okay,
but it
people-
ties into the EU raw materials strategy where it's critical minerals, whatever, where they're trying to have that processing and mining in Europe, which, as we all know, the
Another
Permitting
shortage
issue,
on top of all these shortages. Yeah, they don't have enough
Misinformation.
solar panel installers, but they want to have solar panel factories at home.
right. I mean,
That's right. That's good.
Great.
I have the last question. How many electrical vehicles Stuart has in his garage?
Too early? Oh gosh, 5 or 6, I imagine. I mean, he's got like 7 houses, so you know.
Oh my God.
One for each.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting, this conversation today.
Yeah.
with you all.
Always a pleasure.
TVs.
Oh,
thank you.
bye-bye.
Have a
No,
good
great
week.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.